Hello everyone. So today I want to talk a little bit about the ventricular system of the brain. So three questions that first we have to answer is what are these ventricles and what do they contain and why do we require them? So ventricles are basically these spaces that are left within our brain and the spinal cord that contain a fluid called as the cerebrospinal fluid. And this is very important because this fluid allows us to reduce the weight of our brain. As you know, the brain is a very heavy structure and keeps the brain afloat within the cranial vault. What happens if you don't have cerebrospinal fluid? Your brain is going to sink into the base of the skull, right? And if the brain were to collapse onto the base of the skull, then it's going to compress all these structures, and also the nerves that are coming out, the cranial nerves that are coming out from the base of the brain are also going to be completely compressed. So the cerebrospinal fluid which runs through the ventricles are going to keep your brain afloat and reduce the weight of the brain within the skull. Now, how many ventricles do we have? We have 4 ventricles in total. That is 2 lateral ventricles, 1 third ventricle which is in blue here, and 1 fourth ventricle which is in pink here. This is within the brain, and this continues as the central canal within your spinal cord. So how many ventricles do we have? We have 2 lateral ventricles, one in the left hemisphere and one in the right hemisphere. Then you have 1 third ventricle which is in the midline of the brain, and it continues as the fourth ventricle which is also in the midline of the brain right in front of your cerebellum, and it continues within the spinal cord as the central canal. Now, so how does the fluid flow through these cerebral structures? From the lateral ventricles, they enter the third ventricle through a foramen called as the interventricular foramen of Monro. So there is a foramen that the cerebrospinal fluid from the lateral ventricles exit into the third ventricle called as the interventricular foramen of Monro. From the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, there is a narrow path or a passage called as the cerebral aqueduct, which will drain the CSF from the third ventricle into the fourth ventricle. Now, from the fourth ventricle, there are 3 exits, 2 lateral exits and 1 medial exit. The 2 lateral exits are called as the foramina of Lashka, and the medial exit is called as the foramen of Magendie. Now, how do you remember this? L for lateral, L for Lashka. So 2 lateral foramina are called as foramen of Lashka, and M for medial, M for Magendie. So the foramen through the middle is called as the foramen of Magendie. The fourth ventricle continues into the spinal cord as the central canal, and it exits, a little bit of the CSF exits through these 3 foramina into the subarachnoid space, which I'll be talking about now. So before I talk to you about the movement of the cerebrospinal fluid, its formation and its drainage, the lateral ventricles have 3 horns. One is the anterior horn, the other one is the posterior horn, and one inferior horn. The anterior horn is present in the frontal lobe of the brain, posterior horn in the occipital lobe of the brain, and inferior horn in the temporal lobe of the brain. So all these 3 horns are connected by a body which is present in the parietal lobe of the brain, and a trigone, which is this triangular area that connects this posterior and inferior horn to the body of your lateral ventricle. Now, let us look at the formation and the drainage of the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, there is this plexus called as the choroid plexus that is found within all the ventricles. So what happens at the choroid plexus is basically the blood enters the choroid plexus through the sinusoids and the capillaries that supply the brain, and the blood is filtered within the choroid plexus. So what CSF is basically an ultrafiltrate of the plasma. Now, there is no cells seen in the CSF. If by chance you see white blood cells in the CSF, that could be an indication of infection. Now the CSF that is made within the choroid plexus enters the ventricles and travels to different parts of the brain through the ventricles. From the lateral ventricles, like I already told you, it enters the third ventricle. From the third ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct, it enters the fourth ventricle. From the fourth ventricle, it continues as the central canal within the spinal cord, and also it drains into the subarachnoid space through the lateral foramen and the medial foramen. So the lateral foramen is also called as the foramen of Lashka, like I already told you, and the median foramen is also called as the foramen of Magendie, like I already told you. Now, what is this subarachnoid space? Subarachnoid space is the space that you see here that surrounds or encapsulates your entire brain and spinal cord. And this space is a space that is below your arachnoid mater. The subarachnoid space have these granulations that pop out of its surface, and this granulation basically allows the excess cerebrospinal fluid within the subarachnoid space to then drain back into the main systemic circulation through the dural venous sinuses. So if I have to draw that for you, it would look something like this. So you have the dural venous sinuses and the subarachnoid space. So this is your dural venous sinus and this is your subarachnoid space. So within the subarachnoid space, you have these granulations, and we already know that the CSF flows within the subarachnoid space, and through these granulation, the CSF is going to exit or enter the dural venous sinuses, where it enters back into the systemic circulation. Now, why is it important for the subarachnoid space to drain the excess CSF? It is to maintain the amount of CSF within your cranial cavity or within the ventricles. Now, what happens if there is an increase in the amount of CSF within your ventricles, or this subarachnoid draining system is not working properly? An increased CSF, this condition is called as hydrocephalus, and it's mostly seen in infants. So what happens in hydrocephalus is basically sometimes the cerebral aqueduct is very narrow, or the subarachnoid granulations are not draining the CSF into the dural venous sinus properly, and this causes increased accumulation of CSF within your ventricles. So the choroid plexus continues to produce CSF, but the CSF is not being drained into the dural venous sinuses, so there is an accumulation. Unfortunately, there is no communication between the choroid plexus and the subarachnoid granulation, so we don't have any sort of negative feedback system. So the choroid plexus continues to produce the CSF, and because of some sort of blockage in any part or any foramen, there could be an increased CSF accumulation within your ventricle. So this causes a condition called as hydrocephalus, where in infants your head looks completely big or completely swollen because of the excess amount of CSF. So nowadays what they do is they put a shunt within the cerebral aqueduct all the way down to your abdomen to drain the excess CSF and avoid the hydrocephalus from occurring. How do you find out if you have an infection? If you see a WBC infiltration within the CSF, that could indicate the presence of an infection like meningitis or cerebritis, and that could be another clinical aspect of the cerebrospinal fluid.